This. It's very much a work in progress, so I'd be really appreciative of any comments or suggestions you might have. But this is essentially a research agenda that I want to start looking at around collective action in copyright. And the paper I've distributed sets out the theoretical foundations for that work, and I want to talk today about the empirical component of that work, which starts to look at these models and try to understand what implications they might have for copyright theory and doctrine. So I want to start off talking about open access. And open access in copyright should be relatively low-hanging fruit. Open access, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is the basic principle that publicly funded research should be made publicly accessible. So the dominant policy mode of encouraging open access to scholarly communications has been to attach mandates to grant-making bodies, who then require that the research outputs of works produced through public funds are made publicly accessible. The problem with that approach has typically been that it only attaches to funded research, and a lot of disciplines, including our own, don't have a high rate of funded research. And it hasn't managed to address rising costs, and particularly rising cost implications for library budgets. So this is a graph showing the increased trend on research libraries over the last 25 years. Serial expenditures, so costs of average journal subscriptions have risen roughly 280% over the last 25 years. This is quickly becoming unsustainable for major research institutions, let alone smaller ones, and it's becoming prohibitive for public access to scholarly knowledge. The problem's even worse in the humanities and social sciences, where monographs are still the dominant mode of dissemination. The average monograph cost is now around $100, and the print run has shrunk to about 300 copies worldwide. So this causes huge problems for not only access to scholarly knowledge, but it causes problems for scholars in the humanities and social sciences who rely on monograph contracts in order to secure tenure and promotions. So what I'm really interested in is models that invert the current copyright publishing industry model. I'll give you two examples in the open access space, and then we'll move on to some other examples. But the first one is Scope 3. So Scope 3 is a project led by CERN. CERN, particle physics researcher, after building the Large Hadron Collider and proving the existence of the Higgs boson, decided to attempt something much more challenging and attempted to flip the open access publishing model the scholarly publishing model to open access in particle physics. So they've managed to bring together around 1,000 different research libraries and funders of research in high energy physics, and extract from them commitments to redirect their existing library budgets from purchasing subscriptions for journals, and instead take that money and fund journal production on the input side. So the theory is that if you can take all the libraries who currently subscribe to high energy physics journals, and you can pool that money, you can then reach negotiations with the publishers to fund the costs of scholarly communication without requiring exclusivity, which means the scholarly journals are able to be made available under an open access license immediately. So this is a really ambitious and really interesting project. So far they've raised 10 million euros, got commitments from people, from all the major high energy physics researchers, and have managed to secure negotiations with, I think, 12 of the 14 publishers in high energy physics. One of the publishers was left out because their tender price was too high, but they've managed to secure a commitment to flip the entire field of particle physics to open access, 90% of the field to open access for 3 years, 2014 to 2016. It'll be really interesting to watch this because they still have to collect the money, and they still need to require publishers to debundle their massive subscription bundles in order to lower costs to libraries to ensure that libraries aren't being charged twice. But what I find particularly fascinating about this is the incentive on the behalf of the library, because it would be advantageous for any particular library in this space to choose not to participate in the consortium, instead free-writing, waiting until the material will be made open access, and then its researchers are able to get access. So what I'm particularly interested in is the pattern of negotiations and the social norms and the protocols that develop to enable cooperation on such a large scale. The question then becomes, can this type of model work elsewhere, if indeed it does work? It's still an experiment in particle physics, but can it work in other contexts? And there are objections to this. There are reasons to think that it may not easily be transferable. The first of which is that physicists and mathematicians are relatively unique. There is already a really strong norm for open access amongst the high energy physics community. They already make over 90% of their academic outputs available in a public open access repository. And there's a really strong norm that requires the immediate deposit of new research for the benefit of all of the community. So perhaps that norm is not shared as widely within other academic communities, and more importantly, perhaps it's not shared amongst other creative industries, which typically don't have that strong ethic of sharing, perhaps. And the other point is that CERN is really good at international collaboration. They're able to draw on existing channels to bring together people from across the world, large research institutions and research funders from across the world, to tackle something at this scale. And it's not at all clear whether something this ambitious could work in other academic disciplines. So the second example is something I'm working on a bit more closely. We currently at QT have a researcher embedded in this project called Knowledge Unlatched in the UK. Knowledge Unlatched is a non-profit organisation incorporated in the UK that is attempting the same type of flip in humanities and social science monographs. Knowledge Unlatched brings together 30 or so academic libraries and 400 or so libraries and 30 or so publishers with that same principle. If they can raise the costs of monograph production in advance, there's no reason why the resulting book needs to be made available on a traditional closed license. It can instead be made available to everyone for free worldwide. What's interesting about this is, remember that I said that the average print run for a monograph these days was about 300 copies. So we can do this at this sort of scale. If you're able to bring together 300 to 400 libraries, you might be able to achieve enough, a big enough pool of resources to enable open access publishing. Again, there's massive problems of free writing and selection, but it's a 3-year pilot project that currently has enough seed funding to proceed at the moment. They've been currently raising funds, winds up in 2016. It'll be interesting to see, again, follow what sort of processes are required in order to get libraries to commit in advance to meeting the costs of the publishing system. The Knowledge Unlatched program essentially works by that publishers nominate titles, libraries then agree to purchase certain titles. When enough libraries within the system have agreed, pre-committed, then publishers are able to make that resulting title available under an open access license. So these types of models, what Peter Suzor calls peaceful revolutions, I think are really interesting because they do challenge the fundamental assumptions of copyright. Particularly, they challenge that assumption that exclusive property rights are required in order to enable publishers to extract license fees or sales from their audience. And that the audience in turn are generally free writers who will avoid paying if they can get to it. How these models actually work in practice, whether they can work, whether they're scalable, what sort of negotiations are required to enable them to work, I think is a really fascinating question, not just in isolation, but it has really interesting ramifications for copyright theory and copyright doctrine. So copyright, as we typically think about it, is a utilitarian construct. It exists to, as the Constitution points out, to promote the progress of science and useful arts. And it does so by providing the incentives that authors and publishers require, but it has to balance that against the increased costs of access of knowledge and cultural works to the general population. So this is not, it's a costly trade-off, because precisely to the extent that copyright is effective, it results in the underutilization, dissemination of knowledge and cultural works. So these peaceful resolutions, I think, are really interesting because they provide a framework through which to avoid that trade-off that is at the heart of intellectual property law. So my research project examines these examples, and starting off with open access, which, as I said, seems to be low-hanging fruit because everyone in the system really is deeply committed to the further dissemination of academic knowledge. And I want to test whether these types of models might be applicable in other areas in the creative industries. And we have a lot of examples of where that might be the case, but we haven't yet been able to draw all of those disparate examples together within a common framework. So to give you an idea of some of the different models. So Wikipedia, that you all know, is a fantastic large encyclopedia produced by volunteer authors. They do have a paid administrative team now, which depends on voluntary individual donations and some corporate subsidies. But the content of the encyclopedia is by and large produced by people who are engaged in it without any expectation of remuneration. Free and open source software is another really good example of the power, I guess, of collective action in this space. Over the last 30 years, the free and open source software community has shown that it's possible to bring together programmers from all over the world, some of whom are paid, others of whom are not, in order to create quite large-scale cultural projects, in this case software, that is able to challenge dominant modes of production in the software industry. One example that might hit slightly closer to home is Semaphore Press. I'm not sure whether any of you have heard about it, but Lydia Lauren, who's at Lewis and Clark, is increasingly concerned about the high costs of legal casebooks. And so looking at the casebook industry, that they're charging $180, $220 to students for a casebook, Lauren decided to create a new press that enabled academic authors to publish on a pay-what-you-like model. And this is really interesting. So you can go to the Semaphore Press website and download any one of the, she currently has 3 textbook casebooks produced under this label. And you can download any one of those for free if you choose the free write button. What's really interesting about this model, I think, is that Lauren is finding that a lot of students, upwards of 8%, I think, choose not to free write and instead elect to pay the suggested $30 fee. And they've been able to, we still need a lot more research about why that might be, but there's some suggestion that there is a norm of fairness that applies within this system, that law students looking at a copyright system which requires a fee of $180 are quite happy to pay $30 to support the authors. And it turns out, on that basis, that the royalties that Semaphore Press is able to pay to its academic authors are comparable to traditional publishing firms. So I find that really interesting. Another example, as we start to branch out, looks at how this might be a broader trend in the creative industries more generally. This is Amanda Palmer, who's a recording artist, and she was able to leave her record label, and instead of asking the record label to fund the initial costs of production, was able to go direct to the fans and ask for the $100,000 that it would cost to record her next album. So it's a disintermediated mode of production that relies on voluntary payments. And it relies on people choosing, again, not to free write. It turns out you can go to her website and download her album for free. She did manage to get around 25,000 people to pledge to support the album for some reason at the outset. So this is really interesting. And in fact, she raised much more than her target of 100,000, ended up raising nearly $1.2 million. So it's really interesting to think about what sort of implications this might have for the role of publishers and the role of consumers in various creative industries. We're also seeing it in the games development industry, where independent games developers are able to embark on new ventures by limiting the risk. So let me take a step back. One of the key defining features of the creative industries is it is inherently risky. So the role of publishers traditionally has been to aggregate risk and aggregate capital in a way that enables them to publish both the successful artists and the flops. What's really interesting about these models is that they enable producers to raise their costs in advance, significantly pushing out risk to the crowd and allowing them to bypass the necessity of using a traditional publisher intermediary. This is Double Fine Studios, who have made they haven't yet made it, but they've pledged to make a new game. And before they did so, they were able to go to the gaming community and ask for backers to fund their speculative project. And it turns out that they were able to raise $3.3 million, which is roughly 2/3 of the costs of the video game that they are producing. Other examples, and I'll just go through the rest of these relatively quickly, but this is a hybrid model between the open access and the crowdfunding models that shows that link. This is Unglued. What Unglued has managed to do is to go out, it's a relatively new startup, but they're seeking support from the public to buy back the copyright and the rights to publish certain books and make those books available for free online. So far, they've been at this only for a few months. So far, they've uncovered 3 books, one of which is a really important book on oral literatures in Africa, which they have managed to buy the rights to publish and make available to research communities in Africa for free online. Whether this is a scalable model is really interesting because it shows a desire on the part of the people backing the project, ungluers as they're known, to share existing works more broadly than they're currently available. So they're taking out of print works in particular, buying the rights to publish it, and then releasing it for the benefit of other people. And a favourite example that I stumbled across last week, there's a website called commonly.cc, which is a startup based in Canada run by a guy called Nic Suzor. And he is setting this up as a general model from which to ransom material out of copyrights into the public domain. And in this case, he managed to bring together 7 or so game developers and agree on a price at which they would be willing to release their art assets into the public domain. And they said, for $1,000, we'll release this bundle of assets. And he was able to raise that from unknown participants in 4 days. So it's a very small example, but it serves to highlight the potential, I think, for these types of models to work at larger scales. And he's certainly going to try to see whether this type of endeavor can scale. So that's the fundamental question I am interested in. Can these models scale? Are they unique? Are they reserved to large organizations like Wikipedia, people with massive cultural followings like Amanda Palmer? Or are there more generalizable principles that are able to come out here? So I think, given all of these examples, what I would like to do now, and the project I'm currently working on, is to try to understand the conditions and the characteristics of successful projects, successful cooperation in various creative industries. I don't know whether it's currently possible to compare all of these different industries because they are extremely different, but what I'm going to try to do now is put them within a framework that enables us to test whether those comparisons might be possible. So the framework through which this research is developed is Elinor Ostrom's work on natural resource commons. So Ostrom, through a series of thousands of case studies, was able to show that under certain conditions, it was possible for communities of actors to come together and manage natural resource commons, as agriculture, fisheries, forestries, groundwater irrigation, and so on, in a way that required neither public rulemaking or private property. The framework that Ostrom develops is called the Institutional Analysis and Development Framework. And I think that this is a particularly useful framework to examine knowledge commons or cultural commons. It needs certain modifications, particularly because we're dealing with a resource, knowledge as a resource, which is not depletable. So we don't need to worry so much about pre-writing, but you need to worry more about the production of the resource. It's not the management of an existing resource, but the production of a new resource. But the model, I think, once it's adjusted for that key recognition, provides a really interesting way to start to unpack the characteristics of successful cooperation. The norms that exist and the enforcement mechanisms that are developed to enforce those norms about how people contribute and to what extent they are able to appropriate the benefits of the commons. So through this framework, I'd like to take the existing body of case studies and add to those where necessary, but essentially attempting as a first pass to understand the conditions that allow collective action to work across creative industries in cultural production, in copyright production. So particularly I'm interested in understanding the characteristics of successful projects, the extent to which free writing is a problem, and the strategies that different projects use to deter free writing where it is a problem. The quality question. One of the things that publishers typically do now is select for quality. They have a functional role in the ecosystem to attempt to select the works which are likely to be successful. So when you remove exclusivity, that functional process no longer functions, so you need to think about what sort of projects are actually, works are being created within these voluntary mechanisms. And probably most importantly, I'd like to understand the patterns of negotiation and the complex norms that emerge out of those patterns to enable these projects to actually work in a voluntary, cooperative manner. So that's my project, and I really appreciate any comments or suggestions you might have. Thank you very much.